In a small town in the Philippines, where the streets crack under the weight of poverty and the air smells like rain and diesel and frying garlic, a 12-year-old boy named Tomas Bautista picked up a paintbrush that cost less than a cup of coffee. It was bent at the tip. 3 bristles were missing. He straightened it the best he could against the edge of a table and got to work. Nobody believed a boy like him could paint anything worth looking at. The teachers pitied him. The other students laughed at him. Even the man at the hardware store who sold him his cheap paint once said, with no cruelty, just honesty, "Anak, that colour won't last. It'll fade in a month." Thomas smiled politely, paid his 12 pesos, and walked home. By the end of this story, the entire world would disagree with all of them. To understand Tomas, you have to understand the place that made him. He grew up in a barangay where most families lived on the edge, not the romantic edge of poetry, but the real edge, the kind where you count your rice before you cook it. His grandmother, Lola, was the kind of woman who laughed loud, prayed louder, and never once let the boys see her worry. Their home had one room, a tin roof that turned every rainstorm into a percussion concert, a single electric fan that only worked if you tilted it exactly 12 degrees to the left. And on one wall, a wall that had been painted over so many times it was starting to bubble, hung Thomas's work. Not in frames, just taped up with a leftover masking tape from the market. His subjects were the world around him, the tindera at the corner store who always gave him extra chicharron when she thought no one was looking. The old men playing chess under the mango tree at 4 in the afternoon. A stray dog he'd named Milo, who slept on their doorstep every night like he lived there. He didn't paint what he wished his life looked like. He painted what his life was. And somehow, that made all the difference. What he had for supplies was almost nothing. A stack of old newspapers for practice, a few broken tiles he used as a palette, and paint, not professional paint, not imported paint, but the cheapest hardware store paint his grandmother could scrape together centavo by centavo, week after week. The other kids at school had real art sets, watercolor kits in tin boxes, colored pencils from National Bookstore. Thomas had leftovers and determination. They laughed at him for it. Pintor ng Basura, they called him. The garbage painter. He never answered back. He just kept painting. What none of them knew, what Thomas himself didn't fully understand until years later, was the cost behind every single stroke. Lola woke up at 4 in the morning every day, 4 in the morning, when the rest of the barangay was still asleep, and the only sounds were jeepneys warming up in the distance and the occasional rooster who couldn't tell the time. She prepared her taho, the warm silken tofu, the arnable syrup, the sago pearls, in big metal containers she'd carry on her shoulders to the street corner. She sold cups for 10 pesos each. She did this every single day. No Sundays off, no sick days, no holidays. And quietly, secretly, from that daily income, she set aside a small amount every week. Not for herself, for paint. She never told Tomas. When he asked where the new tube of paint came from, she'd wave her hand and say, "Nakita ko lang sa ukay-ukay. I just found it at the second-hand shop." She was lying, in the most loving way a grandmother can lie. Meanwhile, Thomas's mother, Elena, worked as a domestic helper in Hong Kong. She cleaned houses, cooked meals, raised other people's children, while her own son grew up through photographs and voice messages. She sent home money every month as faithfully as a heartbeat. Thomas's father, Rolando, worked on a cargo ship in the Pacific. He'd been at sea so long that Thomas sometimes struggled to picture his face without looking at the one photo they had of him, taken at the pier the day he left, squinting into the sun, already looking like someone who was leaving. Neither parent knew that their son spent every peso of his allowance not on snacks or school supplies or the things normal 12-year-olds want, but on paint thinner and old canvas scraps from a furniture shop down the road that gave him the rejected, slightly damaged pieces for almost nothing. The way late afternoon light turns golden as it filters through a jeepney window at 6 in the morning. His grandmother's hands kneading dough, knuckles rough, veins visible, beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with softness. The specific shade of loneliness that hangs in the air of a house where the parents are gone, and a child learns to fill the silence with colour. He painted longing without knowing the word for it. His art teacher, Ma'am Reyes, noticed something the other students didn't. She'd been teaching elementary school for 19 years. She had seen hundreds of children paint sunsets and flowers and houses with exactly 4 windows. But she had never seen a 12-year-old paint the way Tomas painted, with this strange, aching precision, as if every image he put down on canvas was something he was desperately afraid of forgetting. She began staying after class to talk to him. Not about technique, about what he saw, about why he painted the things he painted. Tomas told her about his grandmother's hands, about the way Milo the stray dog tucked his nose under his paw when he slept, about the exact green colour of the water in the irrigation canal behind their barangay at dawn, a colour, he insisted, that didn't exist in any paint set he'd ever seen, so he mixed it himself from whatever he had. Ma'am Reyes listened, and then she did something Tomas didn't know about until much later. She photographed 3 of his paintings, wrote a 2-page letter in English, which she drafted 7 times before she was satisfied, and submitted his work to the International Young Artists Exhibition, a competition held annually in Vienna, Austria, with participants from over 40 countries. She didn't tell Tomas. She didn't want to get his hopes up. She barely allowed herself to hope. The entry arrived on the other side of the world with smudged corners and a slightly warped canvas from the humidity during shipping. The packaging was taped together with the kind of tape that clearly wasn't designed for international freight. The judges almost set it aside, then they actually looked at it. The brushwork was raw in places, the materials were clearly inexpensive, and anyone with a trained eye could see that immediately. But the emotion underneath the surface was so undeniable, so completely disarming, that the room went quiet in a way that doesn't happen often in judging panels. One judge, a French art critic who had been reviewing youth competitions for over 2 decades, later wrote in her assessment, "This painting does not show a scene. It shows longing. It shows the specific, unnameable grief of a child who loves people who are not there. I have seen technically superior work from children with every advantage. I have never seen work this honest." When the finalists were announced at the Vienna exhibition hall, Tomas Bautista's name was read aloud in an auditorium filled with artists, parents, curators, and press from across Europe. In the Philippines, in a barangay that had never heard of Vienna, a 12-year-old boy was at school. In borrowed shoes, his own had a hole in the sole he'd been patching with cardboard for 2 weeks. He was copying his notes carefully in a notebook that was almost full. He had absolutely no idea. When Ma'am Reyes called him out of class that afternoon, he thought he was in trouble. He was not in trouble. The video of the announcement, a translator reading Tomas's story aloud to the Vienna audience, the visible emotion on the judges' faces when they learned exactly what materials he had used, went viral within hours. Art teachers in New York shared it with their students. A gallery in London reached out to request a print of his work for a group exhibition on Global Youth Voices. comment sections across a dozen countries filled with people saying some version of the same thing in different languages. This child sees the world more clearly than we do. Back home, the classmates who had called him Pintor ng Basura were suddenly very quiet. His grandmother cried when she found out, not because she was surprised, but because she had always known. She had known since the morning she watched him, at age 7, spend 45 minutes trying to mix the exact colour of her Tahoe's syrup just to get it right. Thomas's first phone call was to his mother in Hong Kong. She couldn't speak for almost a full minute, just breathing. Then she said, in Tagalog, "Anak, I knew. I always knew." His father, reached by satellite phone somewhere in the Pacific, reportedly cried so hard the other crew members gathered around him, thinking something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. Everything, finally, was right. Thomas used a portion of his prize money for one thing before anything else, a proper extended canopy for his grandmother's Tahoe cart, so she would never have to stand in the rain again. The rest he saved for paint. Better paint this time. Though Lola caring quietly insisted the old hardware store paint had worked just fine. Tomas Bautista didn't need expensive paint to move the world. He needed eyes that saw beauty where others saw lack. A grandmother who woke up at 4 in the morning and never once complained. Parents who crossed oceans so their son could have a future, even if it meant missing the moment that future arrived. He needed a teacher who believed before there was proof, and he needed the stubborn, unshakable Filipino heart that keeps creating, keeps painting, keeps singing, keeps building, no matter what the world says the materials are worth. Somewhere tonight, there is another child, like Thomas, painting with whatever they have, mixing colours that don't exist in any store because the colour they're looking for is the exact shade of a feeling no one has named yet. This one's for every Filipino child who has ever been laughed at for trying, for every Lola who skipped meals so a dream could live, for every OFW parent who sacrificed their presence so their child could have a future. Your hands are enough. Your story is enough. The world is watching, even when it doesn't know it yet. Salamat, and God bless.